Hi guys, welcome to the channel. I'm the Jacobian Dev, and in this video we'll be going through how to export Revit Door Data to an SQL database. I've opened a sample project and added a view filter to display the different door finishes. In the Jacobian Dev tab, I'll launch the SQL Doors plugin. First, I'll create a SQL table, which we can check in the SQL Server Management Studio by refreshing the database and selecting some of the rows to view the table fields. Now back in Revit, we can export some of the door parameters to the SQL database. And back in the Management Studio, I'll refresh the database and edit some of the rows. Some of the doors seem to not have finishes, so I'll copy the door finishes to the empty fields. Now back in Revit, I'll import the updated door data. And we can see that the doors get updated with the new door finish values. Okay, to get started, I'll head to Visual Studio where I've got a SQL plugin set up. If you're not sure how to set this up, I've added a link in the description for the first video in the channel on how to create a plugin in Revit. You can also have a look at the Adding Windows Form video on how to add a simple Windows form. I'll start by adding buttons, so under the Toolbox tab, I'll select Button and I'll click to add it. Next, under the button's properties, I'll change the button text to Create SQL Table and the button name to BTN Table Create. I'll copy the existing button and under the new button's properties, I'll change the button text to Export Door Data and the button name to BTN Export Data. I'll create another copy from one of the existing buttons, and under the button's properties, I'll change the button text to Import Door Data and the button name to BTN Import Data. Next, I need to add the SQL Connect class. In the Solution Explorer, I'll add a new class named SQL DB Connect. This will be the SQL Connection class. In the newly added class, I'll change internal to public. I'll then add the SQL client reference from the system data. To get started, I'll create a SQL connection variable named connect. Next, I'll create a function named connectDB. The function will establish a SQL connection. So first, I'll create a new SQL connection which requires a connection string to the SQL server. To get the connection string, I'll open the Server Explorer, and under the Data Connections, I've already created a Jacobian SQL Server database. If you're not too sure how to create one, you can right-click on Data Connections and select Create New SQL Server Database. I'll then view its properties and copy the connection string. And back in the SQL Connect class, I'll paste a string as a parameter to the SQL connection. I'll add a backlash as an escape character, then proceed to open the SQL Server connection. Next, I'll create a function named query, which requires a query string as a parameter and returns a SQL command. This function will be used for most of the SQL queries. I'll declare a new SQL command named command, which requires a string query as the first parameter and the SQL connection as the second. I'll then return the command. Now back in the SQL Doors form, I'll double click on the form to access the form's load method. Firstly, under the document variable, I'll declare a new SQL connection using the SQL DB Connect class. And back in the load method, I'll call the connectDB function, which will establish the SQL connection. Back in the SQL Doors form, I'll double click on the Create SQL Table button to access the button's click method. Now before creating the table, we want to first check if the table we want to create exists. I'll create a function named TableExists, which requires a database name and table value as string parameters and returns a Boolean value. I'll start by declaring a query which I'll wrap in a try-catch statement named exists query, which will select all values from the tables in the database with the provided table name if they exist, and return 1 if the table exists and 0 if it doesn't. Next, I'll add the SQL client reference from the system data and back in the table exists function, I'll declare a new SQL command named command from the SQL connection query. I'll pass the exists query as a parameter. I'll then call the execute scalar method of the command and return the Boolean value, which will be a comparison of the return integer value and 1. Next, I'll catch any exceptions and display them on a task dialog should there be any. I'll also return true if there are any errors. Back in the table create method, I'll declare a new Boolean variable named doesExist, which will call the table exists method, which requires the database name, Jacobian, as the first parameter and the table name as the second parameter. If the table exists, I'll display a SQL table error task dialog, which will state the table already exists. If the table doesn't exist, I'll proceed to create the table, which I'll wrap in a try-catch statement. First, I'll declare a new string query named table query, which creates a new table named doors. The first field will be the doors unique ID, which will be a variable character field. It shouldn't be null, and I'll set this field as the primary key. The next field will be the family type. I'll then add the door mark value. Then lastly, I'll add the door finish. So these will all be variable character fields with a maximum of 255 characters. Next, I'll declare a new SQL command named command from the SQL connection query, and I'll pass the table query as a parameter. I'll then execute the SQL command and display a create SQL table task dialog stating that the doors table has been created. I'll then catch any exceptions and display them on a task dialog should there be any. Back in the SQL doors form, I'll double click on the export door data button to access the button's click method. In order to export the door fields, I need to get all the doors in the project. I'll declare a new iList of type element named doors, which will be a new filtered element collector, passing the document as a parameter. The collector will be of category, built-in category, doors. I'll get all elements which are not element types. I'll then return the elements. Next, I'll declare a new string query named setQuery, which will insert into the doors table the unique ID, the family type, the mark, and the door finish values as the first, second, third, and fourth parameters. To get the door parameters, I'll iterate through the doors list and declare a parameter named door finish, which calls the element's getParameter method, which requires a built-in parameter, door finish, as a parameter. I'll then declare a string variable instance named dFinish, I'll then check if the door finish has a value. If true, I'll get the door finish parameter value as a string. If false, I'll set the dFinish value to an empty string. Next, I'll declare a parameter named doorMark, which calls the elements lookup parameter method, which requires the mark string value as a parameter. I'll then declare a string variable named dMark, which will be the doorMark parameter value as a string. Next, using the SQL command SQL connection query, which requires the set query as a parameter, I'll add the door values to the server database. Using the command parameters add with value method, I'll add the method's unique ID as the first parameter. I'll copy this line to add the other parameters. I'll then add the element's name as the second parameter, the dMark value as the third, and the dFinish value as the fourth parameter. Lastly, I'll execute the command. I'll then catch any SQL exceptions and display them on a task dialog should there be any. Lastly, I'll display a door values export task dialog to let the user know the values were successfully added. Back in the SQL doors form, I'll double click on the import door data button to access the button's click method. I'll start by declaring a query named getQuery, which will select all columns from the doors table. Next, I'll declare a new SQL command from the SQL connection, which requires a getQuery string value as a parameter. I'll then declare a new SQL data reader by calling the command's executeReader method. While true, I'll get the values from the SQL data reader. First, I'll get the door unique ID by getting the string value of the reader's unique ID value. I'll then get the door finish string value from the reader as dFinish. Next, I'll get the element by calling the document's getElement method, which requires the unique ID as a parameter. I'll then declare parameter doorFinish, which calls the element's getParameter method, which requires the doorFinish built-in parameter. Next, using transaction T, I'll declare a new transaction, passing the document as the first parameter, and the transaction name setData as the second. I'll start the transaction. I'll then set the doorFinish parameter by passing the dFinish string value as a parameter. Next, I'll commit the transaction and close the reader. I'll show an update doorFinish values task dialog, telling the user the door values have been updated. Next, I'll set the dialog result to OK. I'll then close the form. That seems to be everything. I'll go ahead and run the plugin. I'll select Always Load to load the plugin. I'll then open the SQL Doors project. In the Jacobian Dev tab, I'll launch the plugin and create the Doors table. Back in the SQL Server Management Studio, we can check the table by selecting some of the rows in the Doors table. Now back in Revit, I'll try to create the table again, and as you can see, it lets us know the table already exists. Next, we can export some of the door parameters to the SQL database. And back in the Management Studio, I'll edit some of the rows. Since some of the rows don't have finishes, I'll copy the door finishes to the empty fields. Now back in Revit, I'll import the updated door data and you can see that the doors get updated with the door finish values. That should be it for this video. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Also, do like, share, and subscribe.